Okay. Good evening, good people. Welcome to our special series, The Invisible, Invincible Asian American, Telling Our Stories. My name is Carla Dupre, the Executive Director of CityLit Project. After such a thoughtful, invigorating conversation last night, speaking to the heart of identity, heritage, racism, and all matter of things, we are even more delighted to present tonight's program and to continue celebrating the remarkable talent we have gathered throughout the month of May. I said last night, while I appreciate a month dedicated to AAPI authors, I strongly believe the celebration of literature must be a year round event. We don't need a special designated month if we are doing our part in terms of representation, who gets to be seen, and who is silenced. But make no mistake, we're glad to be here. At a time when we are forced to bear witness to the global unrest and turmoil taking place in Israel and India, at a moment when rising violence against Asian Americans in this country is unyielding, we are most appreciative to gather beneath this virtual roof to talk about writing heritage into stories, how to be seen, but most of all, how we do literature. Before we begin this evening's program, we recognize and acknowledge we are currently on the traditional lands of the Piscataway people who have stewarded throughout generations. To make this a more meaningful practice, if you live in this region, we respectfully ask you to consider learning more about the Piscataway Conoy tribe, the people where the rivers blend. Join us in honoring and acknowledging the original inhabitants of this land, as well as the enslaved people who built this country and structures that make up our modern North American landscape. We respect our elders, past and present. We'd like to take a moment to thank all of our sponsors tonight, along with the individuals who have given of their hard earned dollars to sustain us through this extraordinary time. We also want to thank our event bookseller, Greedy Reads, whose link we'll post in the chat, as we encourage you to purchase the books of our featured guests. A shout out to our ASL interpreter, Sarah Wong, too. Please be sure to visit our website to download the event program to learn more about the poets and writers and our two curators and how you can engage further and support them. And as a special note, this morning, WYPR featured our curators, authors Aditya Desai and Jung Yun on the Record with Sheila Cass. Both links will be placed in the chat. I'd also like to take a quick moment of your time to describe CityLit for those of you new to us. We're a small nonprofit with a small board, but we have a large literary footprint in Baltimore, Maryland. We have three signature events: our CityLit Festival, which is now a month-long event in the spring, our CityLit Studio, where we hold an intimate, intensive craft talk with two notable authors, and our CityLit Stage, where we partner with the Baltimore Book Festival for multi-day programming. We've been around since 2004, working to make literature a way of life in the arts community in Baltimore and beyond. Emerging authors share the stage with prominent ones. We're mostly noted for the hard truths in our conversations, our authenticity, and how we make literary information accessible to the community we intend to serve. 90% of our events are free and meant for readers and writers alike. Tonight we feature Publishing Asian Voices, moderated by novelist Jung Yang. Jung Yang is the author of Oh Beautiful, which will be published this fall. Her first novel, Shelter, was long listed for the Center for Fiction's First Novel Prize and a finalist for the Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers Award. Her work has appeared in Tin House, the Massachusetts Review, The Atlantic, among others. She has received an honorable mention for the Pushcart Prize and residencies from the MacDowell Colony, Blue Cross Foundation, Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, and the National Humanities Center. She is also a Baker Award winner and a very vital part of the literary community. She's an assistant professor of English at the George Washington University. Please welcome Baltimore's award-winning novelist, Jung Yang.
Thank you so much, Carla, and thank you all for being here tonight. After last night's really wonderful craft panel on reimagining our histories, I was catching up with a friend who lives in Brooklyn on the phone, and I was telling her about the event, telling her about CityLit. And one of the things that I mentioned to her that I really love about this organization that makes CityLit so beloved among authors in this city and beyond is the care and the energy and the real love that they put into every single one of their events like this tonight, the CityLit Festival and the CityLit Stage, as Carla mentioned. It feels really special to work on anything with them, and it matters so much how much they support readers and writers in Baltimore and beyond. I think a lot of that great energy comes from Carla's leadership, her dedicated staff, and a huge number of volunteers who really care about the literary culture in Baltimore City. One of those really hardworking volunteers is my co-organizer of these events for APA Heritage Month, Aditya Desai. Aditya is a creative writer, a professor of creative writing, and he also serves on CityLit's board as its secretary. I just wanted to thank him and to say he has just been such a joy to work with on these events. I think good people bring good people to the table, as evidenced by last night's panel. And also it's been really meaningful to me, I think, to be working with Aditya on something positive for our community during this period of time where we've seen so much unrest, so much violence, so much anti-Asian rhetoric here in the United States, and then also just watching the unfolding humanitarian crisis in India as well. So I think Aditya and I came to this work with a really clear sense of our mission, and we settled on a theme for this event, the series of events quite quickly. For those of you who have seen the really beautiful program materials that CityLit put together, you'll notice that the theme is the Invincible Asian American. Invincible is taking the place of the word invisible, and we thought that that was not only a great theme, but a great visual to represent the strength of the Asian American community, our persistence, our perseverance, and our determination to continue to be seen and heard in many different ways, including through storytelling. As writers, Aditya and I believe wholeheartedly in the power of telling a story, whether it takes the form of a poem, a short story, a novel, an essay, a play. And we also believe in the sense of empowerment that comes from knowing how to craft a story well, but also how to get it out into the world so that people can talk about our work, can think about our work, and be discussing it with each other. We think that's really important always, but particularly in this political and cultural moment that we're living in right now. Which brings us to tonight's panel on publishing. We've assembled a really wonderful group here today, writers who are also editors at literary journals who can speak about publishing through a range of different perspectives and experiences. Just so you all have a sense of how this event is going to unfold, I will briefly introduce all of our panelists, ask them a series of questions about writing and editing that will alternate from the more practical questions to more philosophical, perhaps more political questions about the publishing industry at large. But then I'm going to turn it over to all of you, and I hope that you brought your questions and your ideas and your thoughts. And you're welcome, by the way, to throw, I already see it happening here, a lot of any of your questions that you don't want to forget into the chat. Aditya will help me keep track of them. And feel free, because we are an intimate group, if you hear anything that a panelist says that you really want to agree with, that you want to amplify, feel free to use the chat space for that as well. By the way, if for some reason you're not seeing a chat window, I don't want to assume that everyone knows how to use Zoom or has been spending as much time on it as I have, but look down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. There is a sort of speech bubble icon that says chat. Click that, and somewhere a chat window will appear. Okay, so let's head on to bios. I'm going to go in alphabetical order and start with Hannah Bay. Hannah is a freelance journalist and a writer living in Brooklyn, New York. Previously, Hannah worked for CNN, the US State Department, and Newsday. She is the 2020 nonfiction winner of the Rona Jaffe Foundation Writers Award, and her essays have appeared in Catapult, Slice Magazine, Bitch Media, among other publications. She is an editor at large for the literary journal Pigeon Pages and a 2021 Peter Taylor Fellow for the Kenyon Review Writing Workshops. Next up is Jennifer Chang, who is a poet and the author of The History of Anonymity and Some Say the Lark, the latter of which received the 2018 William Carlos Williams Award. She has poems forthcoming in American Poetry Review, The Believer, Poetry Northwest, A Public Space, and the Yale Review. Jen has been my dear colleague at the George Washington University for many years, but this fall she will be joining the faculty at the Michener Center for Writers and the New Writers Project at the University of Texas in Austin. She is also the poetry editor for the New England Review. Our next panelist is James Han Matson, who was born in Seoul, South Korea, and raised in North Dakota. Whenever I introduce Jim, whenever Jim introduces me, we do this thing because it's just too many coincidences not to talk about. I was also coincidentally born in Seoul, South Korea, and raised in North Dakota. Jim and I met when we were both teaching at the George Washington University. And on top of everything, Jim and I share the same stem of our Korean given name, so Jung. So it's weird. We're almost the same person, but I'm delighted to see him here. Jim is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, and his first novel was The Lost Prayers of Ricky Graves. His second novel, Reprieve, will be published by William Morrow in October. Kiese Lemon calls it, quote, fearless, an eventual American classic that is unrelenting in its beauty and incisive cultural critique, unquote. I recently read Reprieve as a galley, and I have to say it is absolutely fantastic. I highly recommend it, highly recommend pre-ordering it and supporting Jim's work. It is just so good and so of the moment. Last thing about Jim that I wanted to mention is that he's currently the fiction editor of Hyphen magazine. And last but not least, Hasanthika Sirisena is the author of the short story collection, The Other One, which won the Juniper Prize for Fiction. Claire Massoud described her stories as, quote, lucid, wise, and haunting, illuminating the lives of Sri Lankans at home and in the States, unquote. Hasanthika's forthcoming essay collection, it has the best title, Dark Tourist, will be out in December. She is an associate editor of West Branch magazine and an editor at 713 Books in Independent Press. Welcome to everyone. We're so glad to have you. So I'm going to jump in with some questions about your own writing practice. And I'll start by asking each of you to think back to some of your sort of early experiences submitting your work for publication. I think part of the delicate calculus of submission is deciding when something is actually ready to submit. I was wondering if you could talk us through sort of your own process of what ready looks like to you in your particular genre. And also if you could talk about whether or not your sense of readiness has sort of changed or evolved over the course of your writing career.
I can go ahead and start.
Great, Hannah, thank you.
Thanks, Jung. I mean, I think the earliest career person on this panel, and so I'm very intimately familiar with that delicate calculus, as Jung so eloquently put it. And it certainly has been affected in the past year. I feel like I've been especially cautious in the last year. I really struggled to write for most of 2020, and I knew when I had pieces that that I was commissioned to write that I wanted to take my time and make sure that I could send my editor a complete draft. And even that took a lot of agonizing and a lot of time in between. But at least a lot of the time when I'm working with an editor, I will send a complete draft versus a pitch for an essay. And I work primarily in nonfiction and journalism. So when it comes to, creative writing and narrative nonfiction, I really like to send a complete draft of a piece. And when I felt like I couldn't get there, I just had to be really honest with myself and my editor and just say that, I wasn't ready yet and that I was working at a much different pace, more slowly than I had ever anticipated. But I think just trying to be as communicative as possible with your editor is great. And I fully acknowledge that I could be better at communicating with my editors and with the writers that I work with too.
Thank you so much, Hannah.
You're welcome.
Jen?
I forgot how to unmute myself. I think I'm coming at it from a different angle because I'm coming in it as a poet, and it's sort of been it's been a kind of wave of up and down for me. And when I was first submitting poems as a very young writer, I would just send whatever I'd written and just send it to everything, regardless. And this was back in the old days when everything was paper and you had the writer's market and you just kind of like went through the writer's market and pick things out. So it was sort of very, it was very messy. But it was a good experience because it really helped me accumulate a lot of rejection notices and therefore a kind of thick skin to it. So it taught me the necessity of discernment, and not just discernment of what work of mine was ready, but also what journals were in the right conversation with my work. So, you know, I learned early on that there were some editors who would be more interested in my work. It tended to be women when I was first submitting poems. And as I was developing more of a name, I had a little more freedom of where to submit. I'll note a couple of interesting experiences that kind of speak to this, the subject matter of this panel. One is that I would get rejection notes in those early days where editors would write, your work doesn't seem to match up with your biography, not knowing what my biography is. And that was really frustrating. And I got this also, I didn't just get this from white editors, I got this from editors who were of Asian descent and editors who were not white. And the other thing is, more recently, I get solicitations for work from editors who say explicitly that they want a more diverse and inclusive table of contents. And this kind of annoyed me. I didn't want to be tokenized. But now that I'm working as an editor for the New England Review, I see that the bulk of my submissions are from white writers. So it's changed the way I think about, like, when I get asked to submit work because of a desire for inclusivity, that the desire is earnest, and also that writers of color need to submit. That the messiness that I had first engaged in as a young clueless writer, in some ways, like, we should all kind of still retain that in some kind of more discerning way. So I'll leave there.
Thank you so much, Jen. I am really, that perspective is so helpful, thinking about like why you were being asked and then being on the other side of that and seeing who's actually in your submissions pile.
It was really eye-opening, and it made me feel like I had to be more generous to the editors who were asking me in the first place, and not to say, oh, they just want me because I'm Asian, but no, they want me because they want to have an expansive range of voices.
Sure, great, thank you. Jim, how about you?
Yeah, sure. You know, I'm a novelist primarily. I don't really write a whole lot of short stuff. I've written a few short things, but mostly I work on novels. And I'll say this, like, the first novel that gets published is often not your first novel. So my first novel got published in 2017, but I'd written like 3 kind of mediocre novels before that. And one that wasn't as mediocre, but it was, you know, it didn't get published. So that question about, like, when are you actually ready to submit? I mean, if you're going to be a novelist, you have to realize that if you're going to submit, sometimes it just isn't going to happen. You know, sometimes it's just like, you know, well, let me rewind. So, like, if you're going to submit a novel, you have to submit query letters to agents. So it's not like you submit directly to an editor. So you have to have that kind of bridge. So you have to have an agent before you can even get an editor. So yeah, so you have to send query letters to agents, and usually they, you know, they want a few pages. Sometimes, you know, they'll respond and they say they want more. Sometimes they'll respond and say they want the whole thing. But a lot of times, you know, it fizzles. That's what happens a lot of times with books. It's just, it's a really tough business. So when are you ready to submit? I thought I was ready to submit with those novels that didn't get published, but they just, you know, it didn't happen. I think it's just really important that you think that your novel is done, you know, knowing that you're not actually done, because once you get an agent, you're going to have to do revisions. Once that agent sells, you're going to have to do substantial revisions, substantial changes. But in that beginning time, when you're first submitting to agents, I think it's important that you think that it's complete, that it's ready to be seen, and that you've shown it to other people. You've done, the work of like having, a bunch of readers read it and give you feedback, and you've done, multiple revisions. So.
Thanks, Jim. I really liked what you said about writing other novels before you publish your first novel. I remember after graduate school getting my MFA and doing a short story collection and trying to shop it around sort of disastrously and sadly to look for an agent because it felt like this rite of passage. And it was kind of like, I was constantly getting rejected, and sort of realizing through that process that perhaps my ego was ready for the next step, but the work itself wasn't. And it was sort of like one of those hard moments where I just really had to get honest with myself about what was really ready. Was it sort of the part inside of me that had like a beating heart that felt like, come on, I graduated, I had this MFA, I have this collection, let's do something with it? Or was it the stories? It was not the stories that were ready. So I really hear that. Let's go to Hasanthika, who writes short stories, who writes essays. Readiness, like what does that look and feel like to you?
This is a great question, and I think what is really interesting to me is to hear, the different perspectives. I've been doing this, I think, now a relatively long time. I've been doing this for 16 years. And so I've actually been able to see a kind of a change in the expectations. And so, and also because I've accepted that I work primarily in sort of short story and essay. So I work in a sort of short form. And don't tell my agent this, I don't think they're here, but I don't know that I'm going to be doing a novel. I'm not, I don't think it's my thing. And sometimes it's good to know that about yourself, right? There's a kind of a release from that. When I first started publishing short stories, you really had to publish as many short stories as you could, and then you would put together a collection and you would start, and I really was trying to get a novel out. So I probably spent 6-7 years trying desperately to publish really bad novels. So grateful they never got published. And so I had this short story collection, and I kept getting, these works published, and I thought, this is what I really want to be doing. And so finally, after probably about 10 years of just having no luck with this novel, I started sending I took the stories that I felt were the best, put them into collection, started sending them to prizes, and this is really, I think there are people who are really quite lucky and get, 2 book contracts. That didn't happen to me. So this was the way for me to get a short story collection published without promising anybody that I had a novel, was to send my collection to prizes like the Juniper Prize or the Mary McCarthy Prize, which are really great awards, by the way. And, you shouldn't discount them. And I was actually really grateful for this process of publishing in literary magazines, of talking to editors, of building relationships with editors. In some way, it was a kind of a long game, but I'm very happy with that career trajectory. And so I actually think there's a lot of worth in that. I think as far as one of the things that I learned is that and I think this as also as an editor, I think there's a perfectionism in me that wants to just put out the most perfect thing out there. And I think be careful of that. I think it's really important to be submitting. And of course you want to do polished work, but I've certainly seen work that I didn't think was completely polished or maybe ready yet, but I was really willing to champion because I thought that there was a voice there, and there was something there that that's what an editor is supposed to do, is to work with somebody, right? So, you don't actually have to do my job for me and the other end, right? I want to be able to champion people. So if I really want to send a message to you that if you feel scared, like thinking, well, what will this person think of? I don't think badly of people if I don't think their work is quite ready. I don't think, oh, this person is such a failure. I think, okay, this is something, I do see something and I would want to work with that person. So yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think the only time I'm ever sort of really looking forward to opening my email inbox is when I have things out in the world that I'm sort of hoping for an answer, even, you know, yes or no, just hearing an answer about something that I sort of pushed out into the world is kind of exciting. So great, thank you. That was a great start. You know, I think that submission is sort of emotional process. And it's one that can really thicken the skin. It's also one that can be quite bruising to the point where people eventually decide they don't want to do it anymore. I'm wondering if you've ever had moments like that in your own sort of publishing history. How'd you push through it? And what might you tell yourself knowing what you know now, having the experience that you know now back then?
I can speak to that because this is kind of pivotal in my life. So I was teaching at the University of Maryland, and I was querying agents at the same time, and I wasn't getting anywhere. I was just getting rejection after rejection after rejection, and there was one point where I was like, I'm in my late 30s at that point. I was like, I'm in my late 30s. Am I going to continue on with this? Like, is this a sustainable life for somebody who's in their late 30s? You know, but that I felt like that age was young enough for me to maybe pursue something else. So I was teaching at the University of Maryland, and I got classes free there. So I took cognitive neuroscience class, a graduate class, and I did actually really well in it. And I kind of became friends with the professor, and I stopped by her office hours and I said, listen, you know, I teach here. I'm like, you know, I'm late 30s. I'm thinking of changing things up. You know, I'm still always going to write, but I have to think about my future. And she was like, well, you're going to have to start as an intern. And I was like, okay, what does that entail? And basically that means that I'm going to have to work in a lab with a bunch of undergrads. And here I was, you know, but I was ready to do it. I was ready. I was like, I'm going to figure this out, and I'm going to try to like embark on this new career. And so while I was doing that, you know, I was studying up on the potential careers. I was also querying and getting nothing. And then kind of out of the blue, you know, this agent contacted me and was like super enthusiastic. It was just like, I love this. I want you so badly, you know? And I was like, wow, like I didn't expect it to happen. You know, I didn't expect someone to like really want the book. And so I needed that little push for me to be like, okay, maybe this career is sustainable. Maybe I can do this. Maybe I can do this thing that I've wanted to do since I was like a kid. You know, maybe I can do that. And so, you know, that little push was basically what it took for me to say, okay, I'm gonna put that other career aside and continue on. So it kind of was a happy ending, I guess. But yeah, it was, to use your words, very bruising for a very long time.
Thanks, Jim. Jen?
I have a similar story, Jim. I love that. Of course, you would be an amazing neuroscientist. But I remember at a certain point, I was about 7 years out of my MFA, and I was just shopping my book around. And the way poetry collections are published is through contest, and you send in your it's like a huge cattle call. But you know, I wasn't even getting close, and I realized that I had tried different careers. I tried publishing, I tried marketing, I tried arts administration, and I realized what I liked best was teaching. So I went back to get my PhD, and in some ways it's somewhat similar to Jim's story in that I distracted myself a little bit. I still knew I loved to write. I still knew I had to write, but I also knew that I needed to be happy in a more well-rounded way. My happiness couldn't rest entirely on my writing. And, you know, through teaching, and through getting my PhD in English, it just connected me to things that I really cared about. And also I was really touched by what you were saying, Jung, about just deciding between your ego versus the work. And what I was doing was I was taking care of my ego in a way. I was taking care of myself. And one day an editor reached out to me and said, I would love to see your manuscript. And I was like, what? And then it happened. And writing is really hard. With the second book, it was as hard as the first book. And I remember my second book manuscript was with one editor for 3.5 years. And every 6 months, he would tell me, it's not quite right. And I would keep revising it. And for some reason, I didn't send it anywhere else. I just kept thinking, he's really nice and we understand each other. I thought the conversation would keep going. And eventually he just said no after 3.5 years. But during that time, the book wasn't ready. And during that time, I just kept learning what the book was. And I kept learning what mattered to me. And it was really difficult. And it was really hard on probably those around me. But it did give me a chance to think about like all the other things that mattered to me. And all those other things I did to make sure my life was fulfilling, they fed my work too, and they made my work better.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, sometimes the wait, if we're not patient people sometimes, but the wait can be fruitful, even though it's really, really difficult, like when you're in the process, in the moment of waiting.
Yeah, and I'm not saying it has to be difficult, but I'm also saying that there's a lot of balance you discover. That it can't just be, the end goal isn't just the end goal. There's a lot of other things on the way.
Nicely said.
I think what Jennifer is saying really resonates with me. I pretty recently have gotten into literary writing. I took my first creative writing class since undergrad in 2018. And before that, I had been working for more than 10 years as a journalist. And I think that I had a lot of growing up to do and a lot of growing as a writer. Journalism taught me a lot about different parts of the world and the world in general. And I think that it has allowed me to bring a bigger worldview, literally, to my nonfiction writing. And I think that I had to do a lot of growing from where I was as a creative writing undergrad student. I used to write these very, very thinly veiled short stories about like a girl with a different name who had a lot of the same problems that I had. But I was so insecure that I couldn't even really state the obstacles that this character was facing. Like I had this amazing thesis advisor, M. Evelina Galong, at University of Miami, and she was just like, I need to know more about why she's so angry. Why is your narrator, why is your main character so angry, And I couldn't get there. And it took me, 10 plus years to figure out how to explain and how to reveal more of a character who's me and to admit that to a reader and not be so coy. So yeah, I think growing and being ready really counts for a lot. And then again, like finding the right editors. For me, it really came down to like finding the right teachers as an adult learner. I found that finding other women of color who are teachers made a huge difference. It made a difference in the fellow students that I was learning alongside and the workshop feedback that I would get back. And so I see this a lot like in my editor work at Pigeon Pages, in seeing like who the contest judges are. It attracts a whole diverse range of submissions from writers who see something of themselves in the judge. And so that's what I'm really proud of in Pigeon Pages, is the way that they are so inviting of, and uplifting of different voices, which is really cool for me to see as I'm learning how to edit myself.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Hannah. I've written those very same stories that you just described. We should swap ours someday. Finally to Hasanthika.
I've been in the arts since I was 8, not as a writer, as a visual artist. and I'll just acknowledge, I think it's a life of just ritual humiliation. I think maybe part of it is like, you just kind of get used to it on some level, which I'm not saying is, I just want to add, I mean, everybody said such brilliant things. I can't tell you how many times I've wanted to give up. And I think on some level, I've been a little bit like a hamster. I've just been trained to like do it, And so, and there's that, but also I do think there's a lot of value in building a network. I think that of friends. And I really want to stress that, like editors definitely, and also just friends that are, and I remember, I don't know that I want to name him, but sitting with a really good friend of mine, a really, just fantastic poet, and in a restaurant in Brooklyn, and he'd come to visit me, and I was like saying, I really want to give this up. This is really hard. And I was really sincere. I was like really like at this point, like, I could be doing something else. I could be making money. And him, and he goes, no, it's just got to find the right person. And that means the right editor. And I think, and it did. Like, then 2 weeks later, I find out this, my collection won this prize. And the funny part about it is that when I found out who the judge was, I was like, if I had known that that person was going to be the judge, I wouldn't have submitted the collection.
Hasanthika was having some internet connectivity problems, so I think we've lost her, and hopefully we will get her back right away. I really want to know who that judge was, so I hope we see her soon. In the meantime, let's see. Is she back yet?
Oh, no.
Hasanthika? We can see your name, but we can't see you. Okay, so we see in the chat that she is here, but she is struggling, and that's okay. These things happen. Hasanthika, can you tell us who the judge of that contest was?
I don't want to name the judge.
Okay, that's fine.
I'm sorry about that, but because I don't, like I didn't ask them before to whether I could. I just really want to say what the message is to say, don't second guess yourselves. Like, yeah. I wouldn't have sent my collection. I wouldn't have thought this person would love my work, and this person did. And actually, you can find out if you wanted to. You could actually, the judge is public, and so you could actually look it up. But and so I think there is a level of which you kind of have to just believe that this will happen for you. I know that's a lot to ask from people, but I think we all have that story. So.
Thanks so much. Mostly, I think I was curious about who that judge was, because I'm thinking like, who wouldn't love your work? So truly. All right, I have one more sort of writing related question before we shift gears here. And I'm going to take you way back to, I think, the early aughts. I think it was like 2004. One of my favorite novelists, Chang Lee, he published his third book, which was titled Aloft, which came out to sort of middling reviews. And I remember reading one review in particular that was sort of confused, sort of mystified, that Chang Lee, who is a Korean American man, would choose to center a novel around an Italian American man named Jerry, living out in Long Island, as opposed to Jerry's deceased Korean wife or their biracial children. The novel really angered me. It still stuck with me after all these years. And I know that 2004 is a long time ago and things do change, but I'm curious to know, do you feel that there is an expectation that in order to be publishable, that we have to write about Asian or Asian American characters or themes or subjects that might speak to the Asian American experience, which is just a loaded and very problematic term? How do you like personally and artistically negotiate this tension and pressure, if you feel it at all?
For me, Jennifer, you can go ahead if you want. Well, I guess for me, like, I wasn't ready to write about being Asian for the early part of my youth. Like, when I was in undergrad, I don't think I wrote any stories about Koreans. And I think it was because I was still figuring out who I was as a Korean. Right after college, I moved to South Korea for 6.5 years and really started to form my ideas about who I was and how I was affected by this place. And so now I very much put that up front, like on my author bio on my website. I'm like, Hannah Bay writes about Korean American and identity issues. But that's not to say that, you know, we should be limited in any way. And I think that like the way that I push back against that is starting to think critically about stereotypes about Asian Americans. And even in just the journalism work and the essays that I'm like writing right now, I'm starting to really think hard about what kind of stories we're allowed to tell. Like one film that I wrote about recently was Minari, which I wrote a review of for Bitch Media. And I wanted to write about this film, but I was not really sure like if I could do like a quick take or whatever. Like I feel like knowing myself, I knew I would need some time to like process. And what I ended up writing about in terms of that film, my angle on it was that it made me think hard about like, are we allowed to tell funny stories about being Korean American? Are we allowed to tell stories set in Arkansas? You know, I think it really challenged my expectations of what kind of story we're allowed to tell. And it, you know, it doesn't always have to be about trauma. It doesn't always have to be like heart-achingly sad, even though there are aspects of that in the story. But there are also many moments of mischief and joy and, you know, natural splendor, which I felt were really different from what I had seen from Korean American stories in the past. So I feel like I'm being really affected by the environment around me and also through my personal growth.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That essay, by the way, is beautiful, and you're too modest, but if you have a moment, if you could just put it into the chat so people could see it, so you can share it. Something that I just wanted to pick up on, that question, like, are we allowed? Are we allowed? I can't even tell you like how many times I've asked that question, and I started to wonder at a certain point in my writing life, like, where did this question come from? Who do I think I'm talking to? Like, why is this affecting me? Why am I thinking about it? So I'm really glad that you said that. Jen, you had something that you wanted to add?
Yeah, I wanted to think about racial markers in our writing, and when we're using racial markers, is it for a white audience or is it for an audience of like-minded readers? And I've written about this in various essays about how there's this interesting problem for writers of color, especially for Asian American writers, I think, where there's like a kind of collision or a weird kind of crash between the writer's subjectivity and the reader's subjectivity. And, you know, oftentimes I think that when we're writing anything, if there's no racial marker, we know it's an Asian American experience because we're Asian American writers and that's our perspective. But then if the audience, if the reader is saying, no, that's not Asian, well, I think one of the things we have to interrogate is who's reading it and who's making that decision. I mean, one thing that makes me really angry is actually just to take you back to what I was talking about earlier, those early rejection notes where people accuse me of not writing about my heritage, when in fact, it's always about my heritage, even when it's not on the text. And so one of the things that I think that we as Asian American writers and editors should do is challenge our readers to be more careful, more attentive, to be more sensitive to the nuances of perspective, and to think about how their own subjectivity, what their background is, might be interfering with their ability to see the complexity of the Asian American experience as being more than an expected stereotypical representation. So, I mean, I think we should be able to write about everything and anything for the most part within, you know, as long as it's not hurting anyone. But there's no one way to write about our experiences, because there's no one experience that reflects the entirety. None of us should feel the pressure to speak for everyone else.
Absolutely. And yet I do feel that that pressure it exists, it's there, it comes up in conversations quite a bit with agents, with editors.
Yeah, and I mean, my response is always to just push and push.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jen. Yeah, Jim.
Yeah, I have a bit of an experience with this. So when I was at the Iowa Writers Workshop, there would be agents that came in and just talked to us, and we'd give them our manuscript and said, you know, and it would say like, you know, read this and hopefully you like it. A few times I met with agents, and I had this novel that I'd been writing while I had been at Iowa, and you know that's what I was submitting to them. And they would just like, a few of them just kind of like pushed it aside and would like lean in and say like, I heard you were going to Korea. Like, I heard you were going to Korea to like meet up or reunite with your birth family, which I did, just a few years later or a few months later. And I was just like, well, I just submitted that manuscript. Why are we talking about, you know, this thing that I'm about to embark on? And they'd be like, that would be a really interesting story. You know, that would make a really great memoir. And I felt like at the time, I was like, well, I guess I have to write this memoir. I guess I have to write this thing that I absolutely don't want to write because I'm going to be living it. But this is like what they want. And so, you know, I wanted to get published. So I was like, yeah, sure. I'll try to write this memoir. And, you know, I guess you can just recycle that manuscript that I spent, you know, the last few years on. So yeah, I definitely felt that pressure. But I don't feel it as much anymore. I think one of the reasons is because my first editor was Asian American, and like my first book had like most of the characters were not Asian American. There was one Asian American character in the book. But you know, the editor understood what I was talking about in that book. It didn't have to be like this stereotypical rendering of an Asian American experience like Jen was talking about. It was, you know, she understood that, you know, we exist in like this multiplicity, right? And so, you know, she was excited about the book on the book's merits, not on the fact that it was like, you know, rendering this particular stereotype that some people are actively looking for. And like just to what Jen said, which I thought was really great, when she said it's like always about heritage. I think it's true. It's always about heritage. It's always about what's happening inside of you, and whether that's ancestral or whether that's like, you know, just internal, emotional reactions to the world. Whether or not you render a specific character as, you know, an Asian American is really besides the point, because it's you on the page no matter what. So
I've been, you know, as I've been just sort of absorbing what people have been saying, and I have I think I have a strange, not at all strange. I think I share this with other people on the panel, but you know, I'm identify as Asian and queer, and so and specifically I identify as bisexual, and so you know, when I first started, there was, I mean, my agent was basically, oh, we'll keep the bisexuality part quiet unless you want to do a memoir or something in which you reveal, you know, your sex life or something like that. And I wasn't ready to do that. And so I think for me, why I love the short story and why I love the project of my first book is that it was a learning experience for me. I did so much research. I traveled in Sri Lanka. I received a Rona Jaffe. I was really lucky. I would go live there, and I mean, I was eating rice and beans in America, but I would go there and I would use my money there. And I was really grateful. I was very grateful for that experience, and I was really grateful for the opportunity to try my best. And I don't think it was perfect at all, to represent this Asian American experience. I think in coming to terms with queer, I think I needed to write a nonfiction collection to come to terms with queerness, because it was, I didn't feel like I could take on the viewpoints given the way that the queer mind has been pathologized. I didn't feel like, I think I could only represent myself. I feel like I'm not making complete sense, but like in the sort of like the you know, the history of queerness, I felt I had no right to be writing a gay man's perspective. Not that I can't empathize with that deeply, but that's what it was. It's empathy. And so I guess I want to just end by saying that I do think that something that I want to be really mindful of and aware of is the ways in which I perpetrate sets of standard narratives. I think I'm really, in some ways, I'll be honest, maybe more aware of that as a queer writer on some level, because of the ways in which, especially if somebody's bisexual, that straightness, that sort of compulsory heterosexuality really like lassos us and like mainstreams experiences. And so, you know, for example, if I sleep with a straight man, then I'm a straight woman. Well, that's not the case, right? And so I think I feel like I'm not making sense of what I'm really trying to tentatively come to, is to say, I think we all do have to really sort of look at and understand the ways in which our narratives are taken from us and repurposed, and be really aware of that positionality to those narratives. Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
Absolutely, it does. Yes, and I'm seeing other people sort of chiming in on the chat, saying much the same thing. So thank you so much for that. You know, we're getting toward 8 o'clock, and I want to be mindful of the time that we have together. I have a couple more questions, but I'm going to ask the audience to start thinking about your own questions. We want to get to those for sure. I'm going to shift gears a little bit, talk a little bit more about the editorial side of the work that you do. And I'm so glad that Sejal Shah is here. Last night, she asked a really great question in the open Q&A that I'm sort of cribbing from. And the question is this: how are you absorbing or responding to the current political moment? And I'm going to add to that, how has that affected the sorts of poems and stories and essays that you'd be interested in publishing, or would be particularly meaningful for you to publish, if it has affected those insights at all?
I'll go, because I'll just go and say that I have to tell you, as an editor, I desperately want everybody that is here tonight. You can submit to West Branch next year, and you can say that you came to this panel, and I will take a look at your work. I am so desperately looking for queer and writers of color, and also writers that are working and writing about disability. We don't have enough of that. That's the one thing that I think is very clear from being an editor. And I'm also really want to champion experimental work. I definitely think that as an editor, I want to be able, as I get increasing sort of, and you know, that's a weird word, but as I increasingly kind of get more say in what can be published in various places, and I haven't, even though I was an editor, I haven't always had that. I definitely am mindful and very, very much wanting to champion, because I just don't think there's enough out there. So yeah, absolutely.
I would totally agree. And I am seeing the same thing you're seeing, Hasanthika. There's just not, I know so many amazing writers of color, queer writers, and they're not submitting to NER for some reason. I feel like every white man I have ever met, even if it was just I ran into him in a coffee shop, has sent me poems. And you know, I even made solicitations. I'll tell you, I made 10 solicitations, 5 men, 5 women, identifying, and only men have submitted to me of the 10 I've asked. And I really consciously sought to create, I'm still working on it, but it's hard. And I feel that the desire to be inclusive, and yet the voices aren't coming to us for some reason. And we want to hear you. We really want to hear you. We know you're there.
Oh man, I'm really connecting with everything that Jennifer and Hasanthika are saying. I, you know, because I'm pretty new to editing and very much feel like I'm an apprentice, even in writing as an apprentice as well. I try to think about like, what are the barriers to submission? And I took a wonderful class in 2018 with Nicole Chang, and one of her assigned bits of reading were essays from Tony Chulatimuti's column, Publish or Perish in Catapult. And that really demystified a lot of submitting, because when I was an undergrad in creative writing, I didn't know anything. Like, this was, probably 2004, 2005. I had one professor say there was a book called Writer's Market that I could look in the library for, but I didn't know how to do anything. Like, I didn't know how to submit anything. And now things are much easier with, online submissions, but we have to think about like whether the funds are a barrier to entry, whether we're, cultivating voices, whether we're soliciting the right people. Like, sometimes one thing that I've learned is that sometimes, the first piece that you get from a writer might not be the one that ends up being published. I see this happening a lot in Pigeon Pages and my own observation of the editorial process. But, you recognize something, a part of the voice, some aspect of talent that you want to see more of, and you ask for more, you ask to see more from a writer. And sometimes it's the second, third piece that they send in that ends up being the one that you move forward with. But, as I get more familiar with this world, I've also been trying to keep in touch with people. So I recognize names from journals, and I recognize names that I see published elsewhere. And I recognize people who, were, maybe a semi-finalist for a contest, or, got to those final rounds. And I want to see more. And often that's where I find the writers that I want to work with is like, they might not make it, right away, but to being published with us, but I want to keep following what they're doing, and to, add them to my writing friend community too. Yeah, so that's what I've been thinking about in terms of, courting those voices and getting them out there.
Thanks so much, Hannah. Oh my God, Hannah is so not an apprentice. I can't even believe you said that. Just no.
I feel like I am.
No. Absolutely not. I'm gonna skip over that.
Well, I saw Zadie Smith. I saw Zadie Smith speak, and she said that she feels like a constant apprentice. And so I was like, okay, if she thinks that, then maybe it's okay for me to think that.
Then we all are. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. Last but not least, we'll go to Jim.
Yeah, so I sort of have the luxury of working for Hyphen, which is an Asian arts and culture magazine. So like the submissions I get are from Asian people. Yeah, mostly. That's not always the case. There's always like a white dude like sneaks in there and like continues to submit all the time, even though we've like sent him a bunch of messages saying like, no, this isn't really the right fit, there's always that. But yeah, I have the luxury of seeing a lot of great work by Asian Americans. And I want Hyphen to be like a space where Asian Americans can submit and just not feel pressure to have to write about a certain thing. I would like to see like really just any sort of story for any sort of story submitted. It doesn't, you don't have to, I want it to be a place where you don't feel like you have to write what, people expect you to write, kind of like what we were talking about before. I want you to feel like you can write about anything It doesn't mean it's going to, get published, but like I want you to have, I want submitters to have that freedom. So yeah, I mean, it's been great. I get to read a lot of Asian, I get to read a lot of great fiction by Asian Americans.
Thanks, Jim. Yes, Hasanthika.
No, I just wanted to say quickly because I saw a question and I thought that was really important. I don't know who asked it. I don't remember, but about safety in publishing, about about feeling safe in submitting work. And I actually think that's a really important question because I think it's something that we probably all, that are here tonight, and I certainly have, like wondering, what is it, you see, let's be frank, and I don't want to exclude somebody by going, oh, white man, but let's be really clear. That's the majority of the editors still at so many, literary magazine, university-based literary magazines, especially given the makeup of English departments and creative writing departments. And so I do think that's a legitimate question. I think you can check and see who magazines are publishing. Are they really making an effort to publish diverse voices? Is their editorial staff becoming more diverse? I think I don't think it's a bad thing to look at that. I don't want to say that you should limit yourself. I just want to say really quickly, at my collection, the two editors that took my collection are two white men, and they're wonderful, and they let me be who I wanted to be. So I'm not saying, don't ever think that, but I do understand. I think that's a legitimate question. I think it's something that we really need to push as editors and advocates to make all editors respond to, is this a safe space? And I don't think that I can say, and I need to be aware of that myself as an editor.
Oh, Jung, you're muted.
Sorry. Did anyone else want to respond to that question? It was from Aditya in the sidebar. What are the signs that you feel your work will be safe and respected with this pub, this agent, this magazine, etc.?
I can't respond directly to that, but I wanted to add that this conversation is really, really valuable to me, and I'm sure to my fellow panelists. And I know that when I speak to my editor this week, I'm going to tell her what we talked about. And, when I entered into my position, I made sure to hire a really diverse staff. And I think one thing I need to do is to advertise that staff to make sure it's clear that, although NER has always had, all our poetry editors have been people of color, I think it needs to be made clear that even the vetting process is incredibly diverse. And, I'm also really hoping people will ask us or tell us what would be helpful to make it seem like a more safe space.
Thanks, Jen. So Ryan, a little farther up in the chat window, had asked about where we can submit our work. Aditya was kind enough to list the journals that all of you represent. If there are other journals where you feel like you're reading really interesting work, please feel free to add that into the chat as well. That's for panelists as well as anyone who is here. We're all readers, we're all probably writers, so feel free to use that space to sort of fill in more blanks for each other. I don't have my reading glasses, which I just realized, and I'm at an age where I need them. So if I'm missing some questions on the sidebar, I hope someone, Aditya, if you will help me out. I am scrolling through and everything is blurry in your 40s, I swear.
Oh yeah, sure. No, I can jump in.
Please.
Let me see if I can kind of catch up to where we were. Thanks everyone for all of the questions and input. This is a very, very active chat. So we had Ryan's question. Lyra has a question as well about self-publishing. I wonder, what do you all think about self-publishing? I heard that there's a risk of getting the story/ideas stolen, but there's also an opportunity for emerging writers to get their stories out without having to shop around for publishers. Thank you. And I guess this would be for more book length works than short works, which usually find better homes in magazines. But yeah, whatever your thoughts are.
I don't know about publishing, self-publishing book length works, but in terms of self-publishing online, in terms of shorter form work, I've seen it pay off in some big ways. One recent example that comes to mind is Susan Fowler, who was at Uber and wrote on her own personal website about her experience and her critique of their management practices. And now she's an opinion editor at the New York Times after her piece went viral. I don't know if it's okay for me to use this writer's name, but recently I saw in a Facebook group an early career writer who was working in food service during the pandemic and was trying to shop around a piece where they were talking about why they want people to stay home and not eat out, even though they're a food service worker. And they couldn't find an outlet for it, but they published it on their personal website, and I saw it go viral. And I told them, I said, "Hey, I want you to know this is going viral. I've been seeing people tweet it like hundreds of times, and I think that I hope that encouraged that writer to keep going, because it shows that even if a publication didn't say yes, they do have an audience and a readership. And I think that actually makes them more compelling the next time they're going to be pitching, to say, well, I wrote this piece, it went viral. If they even have their own stats from their website, they can say, like, this is how many views it attracted, this is who shared it. And these are all really important skills that'll eventually, be important in like putting together a book proposal, for example, when you say, like, well, I wrote an essay once and it was retweeted by this famous writer, or this famous journalist. And so it's good training to, like, advocate for yourself. So these are just two examples that I can think of from, short form self-publishing.
I actually think that there are genres in which you probably pretty much need to, on some level, be self-publishing. I'm thinking about cartooning. I actually have, because I have a visual arts background, I do some comics. I'm just not as dedicated a cartoonist, but most of your cartoonists, Adrian Tamim, for example, they were sort of like, they would publish their things and sell them at Comic-Con. They had their online platforms before they became who they are today. And so, I think a lot of people don't realize that, oh my gosh, who's the writer who did Mouse? Anyway, I can't believe it. Just for Art Spiegelman was an underground comic, So I am really supportive of self-publishing, and also I just want to pump 713 books, which I also, Leland Chuck is amazing, and he started that press on his own because he really wanted to champion works that were not being picked up by larger presses. So there's also start a press. It's not as hard as you think now. And I think the benefit, though, of I think the thing about self-publishing is that you're going to end up putting a lot of your time, a lot of your money, and it's a lot of your own effort to market. And the benefit of going with a publisher is that they hopefully will put in the time, the money, and their experience with the marketing. But I definitely think it's a great way to get yourself out there, especially given the amount of roadblocks there are, and especially the amount of roadblocks there are to diverse voices.
Thank you. One quick thing that I wanted to add in response to Lyra's question is, like, what are your goals for publishing? If your goal is to get your work out as quickly as possible and to sort of subvert this very capitalistic, very hierarchical structure of kind of the corporate publishing industry, that's one thing. But if you have other goals, such as trying to get an academic position at a university, I don't think universities have caught up to the value of self-publishing. So I don't know if candidates who have those types of credentials, and there are many academics here, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know if self-published books and materials would be considered sort of viable for a candidate for an academic position universities just haven't caught up to that yet. So it just really depends, I think, on what your goals are. Aditya, a couple more questions, perhaps?
Yeah, let's see. The next question was from Sejal, who was asking about work that falls between genres. I think there's been some convo about that actually, but maybe just for everyone, if we want to touch on, yeah, how do you, as editors, greet work that comes in to your publications that may fall between genres or may kind of exist in a middle space?
I'll just say it right now. Yes, send me stuff. Send me work that falls between genres. That's exciting to me. I mean, I think like we have this idea of literary fiction being like sort of these quiet, subdued stories about relationships, which are great. They're great stories. But you know, there's so much more. I mean, you don't have to write these subdued relationships to be like to write a very like amazing literary story. And so when I get a story that falls between genres, I definitely get excited. So yes, that's my response.
I would agree. And I think that in my experience too, there's a lot of conversation between the other editors in the other genres. And my sense is that most people, if they're really paying attention to writing right now, they're seeing that the distinctions between genres are really getting blurrier and blurrier and to our benefit as readers. I am also always surprised by people who are willing to send, most recently I had someone sent me a bunch of graphs and called them poems, and they were definitely graphs. But I think too, there's a certain kind of temerity, whatever you're writing, whether it's something strict genre or not genre, just send it and see what happens. Because the worst is no, people will say nothing. But some of the good things is you could start a conversation with an editor, even if they don't take it right away.
I please send me. I mean, I can't make any promises, but I really love work that falls between between genres, between boundaries, and I mean that's where innovation starts, and that's where also I think that sometimes the sort of realist fiction model. I think there's so much beautiful realist fiction. I don't want to dismiss it, but it's only one representation of the world. And one of the ways that we really truly champion new voices is that we champion sort of real innovation in how a voice comes across on the page.
Definitely. I love that idea of innovation in writing. And Sejal, gosh, as one of your readers, your work has taught me so much about how form can expand and include different genres. And I see that happening a lot these days. And I think it's really exciting. So I'm a fan.
Yeah, I think we can move on to the next question then. Wembo has a question, or a comment and a question. Something that holds me back from pursuing writing is feeling how inevitably connected it is to my self-worth. And if agents and editors don't like my writing, my whole identity is in crisis. Should you, or do you, create some kind of mental barrier or boundary between yourself and your work to help you develop the thick skin that some of you alluded to? So yeah, dealing with the pressure, the mental pressures of sending.
I can speak to that. I actually just published a piece yesterday that spoke to this a little bit, where last year I was really struggling to write. And in my essay, I actually said, like, sometimes when you feel like you're not producing anything, you think you are nothing. But that's not true. Of course, you have value as a human being. And I think that's part of why I've been able to kind of make this foray into writing in my 30s, is because I felt like I was able to get to know myself and know that I have value no matter what. And so I hope that you can remember that in yourself and, have those friends, I mean, several of us on the panel have talked about how friends are so important. Like, I've been in the same writing group for several years now, and we've just kind of stuck by each other and encouraged each other and kind of pushed each other to remember that, you know, we are valuable, even if none of us have published a book yet. So I hope that you have those voices of support that are helping to prop you up.
Anyone else? Jim?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you have to sort of develop a thick skin, but like, I think what you should also focus on are like the small victories, you know, and that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get, you know, you're going to get a top agent, you're going to get a huge contract from a big five, you know, everyone, that's what everyone, I mean, novelists, that's what they think. That's the huge victory. But you know, there's smaller victories that you can celebrate, and those smaller victories are kind of what lead you down the path towards, I guess, the bigger victories, right? So just celebrating those smaller victories. It could be something as like small as like you submit to a magazine, and instead of just a form rejection, you get, you know, an actual comment from the editor. That's huge, you know, because editors get so many submissions. The fact that they like took the time out and made a comment about your work is really telling. Also, like if, you know, if you're submitting to agents, you know, a lot of agents just have this form rejection. But if you get like an actual comment from an agent that says like, you know, this isn't for me, but I'd like to see more work in the future, you know, that's really, you should take that as a win, I think, because all of those will like will pile up, and eventually, you know, if you continue on with it, you know, something bigger might happen later.
And I just got a letter yesterday, actually, from someone who I hadn't heard from in 15 years, who had a similar kind of dilemma. Like, he was very frustrated with what he perceived as failures. And, you know, I think that we all feel a sense of fragility and vulnerability when we put our work in the world. I second what Hannah says, that you matter and you're valuable. But what I said to my friend too was, you know, ask yourself, why are you writing? Ask yourself, what does this mean to you? And for me, I ask myself that all the time, because I want to remember that I'm not writing for publication or for some mysterious reader who I'm never going to meet or who I want to impress. I'm writing because I love the process of clarity. And that's what I feel. But maybe there's something about what you're doing that you really love and that draws you to the page every day. And you need to hold on to that as if it were a pill you could take when you have these moments where, God damn it, nothing is working the way I want it to. Well, nothing's ever going to work the way you want it to, but you get to have this thing that gives you something. And that has to mean a lot, and that has to drive you. And if it doesn't, you know, then you need to figure out what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how you're going to find that sense of self-worth beyond those other voices. And it's true, there are small victories that mean a lot.
Thanks, Jen.
So I just wanted to say really quickly that it's really traumatizing. I think maybe I'll just speak for myself. You know, rejection just feels like it's one, you know, like there's so much policing of identity. Like, it's not like every Sri Lankan has ever said, oh, welcome to the family. I mean, you get, you know, even within our own communities, we get pushback, right? And then, you know, queerness, the same thing, you know. And so to continue to get, you know, like what that agent said to me about, well, we won't mention your bisexuality. That's a type of erasure, right? And so that's a continual process, and it's a real one, and it is deeply, it is very traumatizing, and I do want to acknowledge that. I think find the mechanisms and that, you know, include friends, I don't know, I'm glad to have a therapist. I'll be really honest. A good, I'm not kidding. Somebody you can really contextualize these words in some way that is constructive for you, because it is brutal. And I do want to acknowledge that. And I say that recognizing that I've been on my fair end of rejections, and therefore on my, like as a person rejecting submissions, I'm a cause of that, and I am aware of that.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to add to this conversation. Wenbo, I feel your question very, very deeply. I have heard some messed up stuff over the course of trying to get my short stories published, trying to get my first novel published, trying to find an agent. I will never forget the email that my agent accidentally forwarded me from an editor, basically saying that my first book, she loved it. She thought it was going to be an important book, but she already had a Korean. Like literally, that's what she said, a Korean. I think that there are instances that are, you just hear these types of stories over and over again. But after my book was published, one of the things that I realized that no one was ever harder on me, crueler to me, that I was. Like my own self-narrative was just so self-defeating. I was always comparing myself to one person who did this, or, feeling my age and feeling like I've been doing this for so long, I should be, farther along in my career than wherever I happen to be. And I think that everything that people have said, this idea of celebrating these small victories, tracking those small victories, but sort of reserving your strength and your energy for the fact that, this stuff is real. Sometimes the pushback that we get as Asian American writers is going to be seen and heard and felt. Save your energy for them and sort of, keep yourself whole to the best that you can. So that's just my 2 cents to all of this. I'm looking at the clock, and our time together has just absolutely flown. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap it up to say thank you to all of our panelists so much for being here, for giving so much of their time and their selves and their experience to this event, and to thank all of you for being here as well. And then I'm going to turn it over to Aditya. Aditya, if you could talk a little bit about those videos that I really want people to know about and see, that would be great. I think a nice way to wrap up.
Oh yeah, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining. You have to excuse me, I can't be on video because a strange thing has happened where the sun has set and now my apartment is completely dark, and so you won't be able to see me. And my light is on the other side of my room. But yeah, no, thank you so much for joining us, to all of our fantastic editors and writers. Everything you said cannot be understated, and its value cannot be overstated to the people who are here with us tonight. I'm looking through the list of who's joined us, and there's some familiar names, and then some names that are new to me. But just across the board, I'm so excited for all of them, because I know I'm excited for myself just listening to all of you. And I was the one putting this together with Jung, so I was kind of expecting to be excited. But to know that everyone else who's joined us tonight has been able to take away hopefully something, whether it's a name of a publication or some words of wisdom from all of you. I'm sure it'll come out wonderful. So I just wanted to say that. But to everyone who is here, thank you for joining us tonight. So this is the second of our 2 panels for the Invisible Invincible Asian American, which is a month-long celebration. Last night was our craft panel on reimagining our histories, and then tonight was our publishing one. Both of these will be uploaded to YouTube to view as well. In addition to that, there are also, what we've been doing all month is uploading video interviews with local Baltimore Asian American writers and artists and hybrid practitioners. Some of whom are actually in the chat with us right now, in the Zoom with us right now. And they're just short 20, 25-minute interviews with myself, and just going through their work and their journeys as artists and creators, and how it provides them a bridge to talk about their identities and their experiences. So it'd be really great if you could check this out on your time. That's really sort of the month-long celebration of APOM that we've been having to kind of buttress the two pillars of these panels. So I'm dropping the link of that into the chat. So definitely check those out when you have a chance. And yeah, subscribe to our YouTube channel so that these two videos, whenever they come up, you'll be ready for them.
Can I say too, thank you to the panelists for being vulnerable. You know, at CityLit, we really want to have these heartfelt conversations because we want you to know you're talking to writers who are facing that blank page, who are sometimes dealing with all the things we talked about tonight. And it takes a bit of vulnerability and kind of letting yourself, you know, to open yourself to, you know, people you don't know, but who are experiencing that same kind of thing. Am I good enough? Is this the kind of writing that they want? All these things. And to me, whether you're an emerging writer or an established one, you're still facing that blank page, right? You're still pushing it out, hoping that an editor will recognize you. I can't begin to tell you how these kinds of subject matter help us grow a community of writers. You have no idea what each of you have done to the writers that are in this panel, you know, giving them strength to push that work out. Because bottom line, our publishing industry tells us that, you know, we're not being seen. You know, we need more stories in those journals, poetry journals, those contests. Push that out. You know, I have to say, especially women, because we hold on to that. You know, we don't send the work out once we get a rejection. It has been proven that not enough women submit. But I can't thank you enough for being here today. Please look at the program on our Instagram, on our website, because it gives you information about these writers who are presented tonight. It includes the website, the links to their website, and their social media. Follow them, support them, buy their books, hopefully through Greedy Reads, but any way that you can support an independent bookstore. But I'm so appreciative, Jung and Aditya. Honestly, when we talked about having this thing, I knew the two of you could take off with it and run, and that you did. I couldn't be more proud. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for giving us the platform, Carla. And again, thank you to CityLit. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you all so much for being here tonight.
Thank you.